Good afternoon. Welcome to Kent City Council Workshop for Tuesday, April 16. We have two items on our agenda, and first one is legislative update, and we have a very talented Briahna Murray here with us. Welcome.
Thank you, Mayor, Council President, and Council members. I'm Briahna Murray. I'm your Olympia-based advocate. And this evening, I am here to provide you with a presentation on the outcomes of the 2024 session. And spoiler alert, I do not have a lot of great news to share. With that being said, I hope you'll bear with me to dive into a little bit of the details. I'd like to provide you with a broad overview of what occurred this past legislative session, as well as the outcome of your legislative priority and some of the additional legislative issues that were discussed this session, and talk a little bit about next steps. So starting first with a broad overview of this past legislative session, as you likely recall, the legislature operates on a two-year cycle, and the 2024 session was the second year of that two-year cycle and was a short legislative session scheduled to last 60 days. Similar to the 2023 session, Democrats held strong majorities in both the House of Representatives and the State Senate. As the second year of the biennium, all legislation that was introduced in 2023 but did not pass into law carried over and was continued to be in consideration in 2024. That was right around 1,200 different bills. In addition to those approximately 1,200 bills, another 1,500 new bills were introduced for the session. Across all of those bills, 376 passed into law. You can see on the right there a bar chart that shows the number of bills introduced each session and the number of bills that passed into law. A lot of folks felt that there were a large number of bills that passed during the 2024 session, but if you actually look at the data, 2023 was a considerably larger number of bills. In addition to talking about various policies and legislation, the legislature had the task of adopting their supplemental operating, capital, and transportation budgets. The state has a two-year budget cycle. They did the bulk of their budget work in 2023, so during the 2024 session, they're going in and making modifications and amendments to the budgets that they had just recently adopted. One of the major themes of this of the 2024 legislative session is that we saw a lot of bold proposals and then a lot of modest action. So lots of bold ideas, and then it sort of petered out over the 60 days to be some modest action. The other is the legislature had to grapple with what to do with a historic number of initiatives filed to the legislature, and I'll get into that a little bit more here. The supplemental budgets that were considered were all reflective of an increase in spending. The increase in spending that we saw across all three budgets was largely attached to the Climate Commitment Act, and most of the investments that were made utilizing that funding source were contingent on the failure of one of the initiatives that you'll see on November's ballot. The operating budget, which funds all state agency operations and the most significant expenditures, the K-12 education system, spent an additional $2.1 billion beyond what they adopted in the 2023 session, for a total of $71.9 billion. $2.8 billion was held in reserves. That's slightly higher than what they adopted in 2023. $1 billion of that new spending is what was needed in order to just keep existing programs operating to meet existing caseloads and rising costs. So there was only about $1 billion in actual new spending, despite the $2.1 billion being the increase. The capital budget funds bricks and mortar construction projects for both state agency projects like new community college buildings, new schools, new state agency projects, but it was also where a lot of nonprofit and community projects are funded. Very limited funding in this budget for the supplemental year. The average appropriation going to community projects was right around $300,000 a project. So I know that one of the things that we had grappled with in developing your all's legislative agenda was whether we should have included project funding requests. You all received a large amount of funding in the 2023 year, and we really wanted to keep this session focused on public safety. So if you wanted me to quantify any kind of missed opportunity, I would say it was around 300,000. In my mind, I don't see that as being a significant missed opportunity given the other issues we worked on this session. Of the additional spending in the capital budget, I just note that $127 million was allocated to the Housing Trust Fund, which was a fairly significant increase, and the bulk of the funding coming out of this budget. The transportation budget is the most challenged of the three. It had an increase of $1 billion in spending. However, most of that money is tied to the Climate Commitment Act. The traditional revenues that fund transportation were actually down 8% from 2023. So the transportation budget will continue to face obstacles. I will note that one project that is important to you all is the Puget Sound Gateway project. One of the proposals we saw throughout the legislative session would have negatively impacted the delivery of that project. And so I'm pleased to share with you that in the final budget, those negative impacts were not included. They found a way of keeping that project whole. I referenced a historic number of initiatives to the legislature. There were 6 that were filed. That is, never have there been that many in state history in one year. The last time they even got close was in the 70s, and there were 3. For each initiative, the legislature had the opportunity to either enact the initiative, develop an alternative to the initiative that would appear on the ballot alongside the original one, or do nothing and just allow the initiative to go onto the November ballot for voter consideration. The legislature enacted 3 of the initiatives, one prohibiting state and local income taxes from being imposed, another increasing parental rights around K-12 education, and a third allowing officers to engage in vehicular pursuits if there's reasonable suspicion that a crime has been committed. The legislature did not act on Initiative 2117, repealing the Climate Commitment Act, Initiative 2109, repealing the capital gains tax, and Initiative 2124, allowing individuals to opt out of Washington's long-term care retirement program. Those 3 will appear on November's ballot. The Democrats that chose to not take action on those 3 or develop alternatives indicated that their primary reasoning for doing so, outside of the policy support for the proposals, is that it would require a significant amount of work to adjust the budget if those revenues from these 3 proposals were to go away. And I do think that is an accurate statement. If these are approved by voters, a bulk of the 2025 session will be spent grappling with the reduction in revenues from these proposals going away. Okay, transitioning to your all's legislative priority. We made a strategic decision going into this session, given that it was a short 60-day session and you all had a very bold goal, we focused on a single priority, and that was requesting councilmanic taxing authority to fund public safety in the criminal justice system. We worked closely with the Association of Washington Cities, the Association of Sheriffs and Police Chiefs, and other jurisdictions to draft and coordinate for the introduction of the bill in the House. House Bill 2211 was introduced and sponsored by Representative Stearns, Orwell, Gregerson, and Hackney. And in the Senate, Senate Bill 6076 was sponsored by Senator Kaiser. I've only mentioned those legislators from your city that represent the city on this list. There were legislators from outside the city of Kent that also signed on to the proposals, but I wanted to highlight your local legislators that were actively listening and supporting our efforts. There was public hearings on each proposal. The House had a public hearing in the House Local Government Committee, and the Senate had a public hearing in the Senate Ways and Means Committee. Several of you on the dais participated in those public hearings, which I greatly appreciate. From my perspective, the public hearings, I thought, did an exemplary job of demonstrating the need. And I do believe that the committee members that heard the proposals understood why and what we were asking for. However, they chose not to advance the bills forward, and the concerns that I had shared back with me from a variety of different legislators were a hesitancy to raise the sales tax, whether it's locally enacted or statewide enacted, because it is regressive. I do believe that we responded to that concern, but I think it was still outstanding for them. There are concerns about the idea of just increasing funding to hire law enforcement officers over other needs, recognition that local government engages in a lot of services, so why increase funding for law enforcement and not some of the other services that cities provide? A preference to address the 1% cap on the property tax levy growth instead of, so sort of an either or. At the end of the day, the legislature chose to do neither, but when our bill was under consideration, that was a refrain repeated back to me. So Republicans, there are several who are willing to vote for the bill. However, I would say a broader statement is that many indicated a preference to, yes, increase public safety funding, but to do it with state resources, which Democrats were not willing to do. So their preference was to not do a tax increase. One thing that went unstated, but I want to make sure is just daylighted, is that approving taxing authority prior to an election is often politically challenging, and I believe that was a factor in the decision making whether folks are willing to say that out loud or not. I think as you talk with legislators, they will indicate that there are several things that they did do this last session on public safety. And so I wanted to share that with you so that you would have some context when, if you are conveying disappointment about how the proposal didn't advance forward, how they might respond. And I think one of the things they'll respond with is to say that they did take action. They approved Initiative 2113, which is the vehicular pursuit proposal, which I mentioned earlier. They removed the 25% local contribution for training officers through the Basic Law Enforcement Academy. That was about a $4 million appropriation in their operating budget. They approved several different bills to make it easier to hire law enforcement officers from their perspective. So law enforcement officers being allowed to work part-time, being allowed to hire DACA residents as law enforcement officers, or being allowed to have lawful permanent residents hired as officers. There were also several bills and appropriations that worked to advance very specific crimes. House Bill 2153 increased the penalties associated with catalytic converter theft. House Bill 1989 is a direction to try some new technology to identify those individuals who engage in graffiti, with an emphasis for focusing on the I-5 corridor. $1 million was appropriated to a pilot program to respond to organized retail crimes. And then one thing that's not on the slide is there was a lot of discussion and emphasis on responding to the opioid epidemic. And the legislature's primary action on that front was to put a lot of resources and policy around increased education and outreach, as well as Narcan being more readily available. So while the legislative priority that we advanced forward, that we requested, did not advance forward, the legislature did consider several other bills that did pass into law. I'm not going to spend a lot of time on these, but I wanted to highlight just a few. One of them, House Bill 2384, is related to automated traffic safety cameras. We did end up spending a significant amount of time engaging on this policy, and I'm pleased to share with you that for the most part, the programs that you all currently have in place are not negatively impacted by the proposal. I will note that the bill sponsor, Representative Brandy Doherty, worked closely with us to try and find the right language, and I think she also recognizes that the language maybe continues to need some refinements. So I would expect that we're going to see modifications to these statutes in future legislative sessions. But those modifications would be in an effort to try and honor the existing programs in place. House Bill 1998 is a bill that you all will need to take action in order to implement. It mandates that co-living housing be allowed in all residential areas. Similarly, Senate Bill 6015 has residential parking standards that you all will need to implement. It has a requirement on the standard size of a parking space and requirements that garages have to count as parking stalls or parking spots, things along those lines. House Bill 1105 is another bill that will take action for you all to implement, and it is creating deadlines on when public comment has to be submitted on certain actions. The legislature made modifications to the tax increment financing program you all haven't yet utilized, but I think are well suited to take advantage of at some point in the future. And they also did a B&O tax exemption for child care facilities. I think that a lot of this past legislative session can be defined not so much by what the legislature passed, but what they didn't pass. So not only did they not pass the public safety proposal that we brought forward, they also didn't pass a large slew of other proposals, both good and bad. And so they did not pass a bill that would have capped rent increases, would have required or mandated lot splitting, which means every residential lot would have been mandated to be divided at least into two, preempting the siting of shelter space to require Commerce review and approval of any siting of permanent supportive shelter, mandates around transit-oriented development, increases in the real estate excise tax, and lifting the property tax levy growth. So these are just an example of some of the proposals. There are obviously hundreds of bills that didn't pass into law, but these are some that would have had an impact on the city and did not pass. And I do think that much of this past legislative session can be defined by what didn't pass. There's one, I was going to say there should be one more slide. Which is really to talk about next steps. I identified for you some of the new policies that they passed that are modest in nature that you will need to take implementation action on. My eyes are definitely on November of 2024, where you have all members of the House, half the Senate seeking re-election. We saw a large number of legislators announce that they are not seeking re-election. So we're going to see new faces in Olympia, regardless of whether there's a political shift. Also on the November ballot will be those three initiatives, and the outcome of those three initiatives will affect the workload, the shape of the conversation around what occurs during the 2025 session. So I'll be watching that closely. Along the same time as campaigning and election activity is occurring, I encourage us all to begin thinking about and preparing for the 2025 session. The 2025 session will be the start of a new legislative biennium. I think it is going to be a lot of new faces. They will reconstitute their committees in a different committee structure with different chairs, different ranking members, and so it will be an opportunity for a fresh and new dynamic. So I think it behooves all of us to think about what the City of Kent and the Kent community would like to see happen within the next 2-year process. And because I'm a glutton for punishment, it starts on January 13th, and I just can't wait. So with that, I'm happy to answer any questions that you may have. I wish I had more positive news for you, particularly around your top identified legislative priority. I do think it was the right strategy call to remain focused on that, but I'm sorry that that strategy call just wasn't enough to get us across the finish line.
Thank you, Briahna. Any questions? Councilmember Boyce.
Thank you, Madam President. Brenda, do you know what's the dollar value that's tied to the initiative? Let's see if they get passed. Do you know what the impact would be?
Off the top of my head, I don't know that, but I can certainly follow up with it. As part of the legislature's deliberation, they were required to get a fiscal note. So there's an actual document that outlines the fiscal implications of all three of the proposals that will be on the ballot. I'm happy to circulate those. I just don't know off the top of my head.
Any other questions or comments? Mayor Ralph.
Two questions. I'm good. On one of the initiatives was regarding the Long-Term Care Act. I know that Senator Kaiser was either talking about or had brought forward an ask about allowing that to transfer out of state. Did that pass?
It did pass, yes. So the bill to allow that benefit to transfer out of state. So if you are enrolled in the program, you accrue the benefit, and then you move and decide you're going to retire in Hawaii, you can still access that benefit. The initiative is a separate policy that says you're not required to participate in the program. There was a window of time when individuals could choose to opt out if they demonstrated they had their own long-term care policy. And so there are individuals who have already opted out of the program if they were able to demonstrate that, but that window has now closed, and so the initiative would allow anyone to opt out regardless of whether they have a long-term care policy and regardless of the time window.
Okay. And a second question around transportation. One of the things you noted is the decrease in traditional funding sources for transportation. There's been a lot of conversation around the RUC. Did that continue this session, and where did that end? It is the primary financing tool presumed in our regional transportation planning, so curious about that.
Yeah, so I think as a replacement for declining revenue sources, the road usage charge, or RUC, is still the predominant item being considered. It didn't, I think funding was allocated to continue the current work. The Transportation Commission has been conducting a pilot program and feasibility study on how to push out a statewide program. And I think they provided that same ongoing funding to keep that work going. But beyond that, there was no additional action taken. I think the hope from some, and I don't want to put words into the Transportation Committee chairs' mouths, but I think the general idea around what comes next is very dependent on what happens with the Climate Commitment Act. If the Climate Commitment Act is not repealed, and stays in place, I think there is still a desire to do some sort of a revenue package for transportation in the 2025 session. Similarly, if it is repealed, there will need to be some sort of transportation revenue action taken in order to backfill the significant lost revenue. And then the question becomes, what revenue source do you identify that could both backfill and move the state into more positive transportation investments beyond what they've already committed to?
Thank you.
Thank you, Madam Mayor. Any other questions or comments? Well, thank you so much, Briahna, and we appreciate all the work you do for us in Olympia.
Yes, it was an honor and pleasure, as it always is, even though we lost this year.
We look forward to your reports on Fridays and the weekends and all the emails that come through. So thank you. I know you put in a lot of work into this, so we appreciate you, and you keep us updated. So thank you, and we will see you soon, I'm sure.
Yes, thank you.
Thank you so much. All right, next item on our agenda is Police Department data application, and we have Officer Eric Doherty.
Hello. Thank you, Mayor, Council President, Council members. I'm Officer Eric Doherty. I'm the Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion Officer for the Kent Police Department. I was here earlier in the year talking about the police contact app that we developed, just kind of as a refresh. All the officers have it on their phone, or they can use it in their car computer. The intent of it is to capture data that we weren't capturing before. It's used for proactive contacts that the police do, so not a 911 call where they're responding to something someone's asking. It's they're out in the public, they're driving around, and they either make a traffic stop or they decide to contact somebody. And so you'd ask that we come back once it was running for a bit, so we had some actual data. So this is the first quarter 2024. This first one is just showing we've had a steady increase in usage over time. We talked a little bit about the adoption period. One of the audits I did late first quarter is around 85%. And it looks like primarily it's officers who make very few contacts that are forgetting to use it because it's a new thing. The officers who are making consistent contact seem to have caught on and are using it consistently. During this period, there was 1,038 contacts logged into the app, so over a 3-month period. And this is a screenshot of what the front page of the app looks like. They have 3 options. They did a traffic stop. They did on-view enforcement, which again, they decided to go take some sort of enforcement action. And that could be as small as they see someone loitering in front of a business that we have a no trespassing agreement, and they ask someone to move along. It doesn't mean they're throwing someone in handcuffs or it's necessarily a huge criminal thing. It just means they are enforcing some sort of law or investigating some sort of law. So this could be someone parked in a parking lot late at night. It looks a little suspicious. We go and contact the person. Regardless of how that turns out, they log it just so we know what we're out there doing. And then the community contacts, those are ones where it's non-enforcement. So this would be handing out stickers to a kid, or you're just saying hi to someone. Those are optional. We only had 67 logged. That doesn't mean that's the amount of times we actually contacted. A lot of those you just kind of casually do throughout the day. So these would be more usually like intentional. I'm going to go to this place to do this friendly contact. Those are primarily what's getting logged there. So 623 traffic stops, 348 of the on-view enforcement, and then, like I said, 67 of the community contacts. And so once we have these, and sorry, it's a little hard to see. I should use a bigger font. We can break it down. Once we have the data, you can export it and play around with it however you want. And so one of the questions is, what happens when we make a traffic stop? So you'll see through here, 68% or 66% of the time, it's a warning. And that's information we didn't have before. We might have intuitively kind of known how often we're giving warnings versus tickets, but we didn't track warnings before. So we only knew how many tickets we gave in a year. 26% of the time, someone gets a ticket. 4% of the time, it turns into some kind of arrest. So it could be a DUI, could be a license offense, someone with a warrant. And 4% of the time, the driver doesn't stop, just takes off. So we're tracking that now because that's become a big issue. And so make it really easy. The officer just clicks one button, says, yeah, the car took off. And so now we know 4% of the time that we try to make a traffic stop, the car just doesn't stop for us. And then once you have the type, you can break it down by demographic, because that was one of the big issues we had. We had a lot of questions that people had for us about the demographics of people that we're contacting, whether that be through traffic stops or out on the street, and our answer was always, we don't know, because it wasn't tracked. So now we do know. So this is just for example. You can break it down by gender. So this is how often we issue a ticket versus a warning versus effect an arrest on a traffic stop. And then you do the same thing by race, because that was always a question. One of the biggest questions was, how often do we give warnings to different drivers based on race? And so these are the total numbers. The next screen is just literally the percentage of time we give a warning. On the outer sides, there's very few traffic stops that were made within those demographics. So you're going to see huge, you pull one person over and don't give a ticket, you have 100% warning rate. But in the middle, you'll see, demographic groups that have a large number, and you'll see the percentage of time that drivers of different demographic groups are given a warning versus a ticket, which was always a question people asked, and now there is an answer. And again, this is only 3 months worth of data, which isn't really enough to show long-term pattern, but it can start to give us an idea, and the longer that we run this, the more it'll even out to really show what we're doing. If you want me to wait on any of these slides, I can wait too. And then, so we do the same thing. So these are on-view enforcement contacts. I broke this down, detained or not detained, because that was another question that came up a lot. Within the context that we're making, how often are we choosing to detain someone? Detaining doesn't always mean handcuffs, but it means the person is not free to go. So it could be us verbalizing it, having them sit down while we investigate. And you'll see that in the majority of stops that we make, the person is detained. If we're out there and we're making the choice to enforce some kind of law, more than half the time within any demographic group, the person is being detained. One of the questions that came up is, are Black individuals more likely to be detained during these contacts? And again, that's something we said that we don't know. So far as this shows, they're slightly less likely to be detained. So the not detained bar is higher in comparison. And again, this is a small enough sample size, but it does at least answer the question, and some of the things people were concerned about aren't jumping out in the data. And then once we have these data points, we can, because it's built on the GIS system, so it's all able to be mapped. And so this is just one quick example. The red heat map spots are traffic collisions in the city. The green dots are where we made traffic stops. And so this is just one example of some usefulness in that we can see, hey, are we doing our traffic enforcement where we have these red dots? You can see for the most part we are, but there's some on the outer limits of the city that we're maybe not hitting as often. And then we could make the decision, let's go and do some traffic enforcement there and see if it makes any impact on collisions. You can do the same thing with the on-view enforcement contacts. So if we're having, a hot spot of crime, we can then send officers out there to make contacts, and then at the end of it, track and see, did those contacts make a difference? And if they didn't, we can reevaluate how we want to go about it. Maybe we need more, maybe we need a different strategy, but it gives a nice way to visualize it. So everything that comes out of the app can be mapped against everything that we already have in our existing systems, whether it be calls for service, crimes, our police reports. And so particularly once we have a GIS person on board, which I think we're going to get at some point in time, we'll be able to do a lot of tools with the mapping from all of this. So that was a quick overview of the data there. Do you have questions about this or about potential future uses of it?
Thank you, Officer Doherty. Councilmember Troutner.
Thank you, Madam President. I think on one of your slides you noted that this is just the officer's observation of how they describe the person versus asking or
correct.
being
Yeah.
disclosed.
Yeah. So as we talked about the last time I was here, this is definitely not them asking, hey, what are you? Where are you from? Or anything like that. It's just the officer's observation. And then we go back. So the categories that we have, if you can see there, we're trying to match where the census is going, and just recently they made the change because there's been a big push to add Middle Eastern, North African into it, because the traditional census categories were a little too clumped. And so we developed the app in anticipation of that so that hopefully it'll match better moving forward. So these are the categories that the officers have to choose from. We intentionally didn't put an other unknown that exists in a lot of our other forms, and there are times that you really don't know or can't tell, but it tends to get overused, and if you have 30% unknown, none of your data is good, and so we're sort of forcing officers to at least make a best guess choice on it, but it is completely just officer's observation.
Councilmember Fincher.
How's it being accepted by the officers? How long does it take to fill out?
So I try to, on my own, do it as slow as I could, and as long as I can make myself take is about a minute maybe. I think it's a lot faster if you're used to it. We have some officers here, they might have a different opinion. I haven't heard officers complain to me about it. I do know I have heard some just kind of general, they have a lot of different forms to fill out for a million different things, and this is one of them. And so I think, as a broad, just, a lot of what we do, we're tracking a lot of different stuff, that it can kind of get clumped in. But as far as like the usability, I haven't heard any negative feedback. And we ran pilots on it where I was getting feedback from officers to make it as useful as possible. And I made some design changes on a couple of the things that people said, hey, this is a little clunky. So we tried to make it as streamlined. And I think, let's see, it looks from back there, I think it's fairly easy to use. Not as easy as not doing it, but not as burdensome as if we had to write a full case report every time we went out and contacted somebody.
Any other questions or comments? So I have a few, kind of. So to encourage officers to use this more, is there like a reminder before the shift or?
Yeah, so the individual sergeants with their crews have done reminders. I know command staff has done reminders, going down. What I started doing, because I think a lot of it at the beginning too was people not being quite sure when to use it or not, based on the contact. And so I started just doing a printout of everything I could find in our CAD system that looked like it probably was a time to use it, and then just give that. And I think that helped visualize, oh, okay, here's where it should be used. And so I think those reminders help. Like I said, it's difficult if you're an officer who doesn't do a lot of these contacts and you do one every 3 months to remember. So that's always going to be a bit of a hurdle.
And the demographics, so I guess would a person who looks like me be considered Asian, I guess? Is
Yes.
that okay? I think those can be configured if anything comes up down the road, I'm assuming, or...
Yeah, and so within the app itself, we can always change, add, modify anything. All this data, of course, will stay how it is, but you could subgroup things down the line if that became necessary. A lot of our current report systems and stuff has to go to the federal government, so they have guidelines on how they accept it. So something like this isn't going to match what they're asking for because they're still asking for stuff based on previous census. But there's ways that we can do that. We can group it before we send it out. And so we're trying to get all of our different systems to match as closely as possible. And then in the future, if people, say, you want to distinguish between East Asian and Southeast Asian, you could easily do that.
Councilmember Michaud, followed by Councilmember Boyd.
Thank you, Madam President. Eric, I just want to thank you for your work on this. This looks great and simple and super easy to use. I think the GIS component could be very useful for the whole department. So thank you for your work.
Thank you.
Yes, thank you, Officer Doherty. Great presentation. I only have one question and that is, percentage-wise, how many of the officers are actually using this app? Do you know?
It's almost all have used it at least some. Last I checked, trying to remember, there might have been one or two that hadn't, but we've had people on an extended leave. We have, I can't remember, 75-ish patrol officers. But yeah, so everyone, it looks like, has used it at least once. And then the range is pretty big. Our most proactive officers have pushing, I think, 200 contacts now, maybe, since we launched the app. And then there's some that have less than 5.
Okay, but you have no officers that have not used it at all, right?
So we have to check if anyone still hasn't used it at all. It would be a very small number if anyone hasn't used it at all.
Okay. All right, thank you.
Councilmember Fincher.
Thank you. On this slide here, are they able to check only one, or could they check two? An example would be, I am stopped, and then obviously I am not only Black, I'm Afro-Latino, because I only speak Spanish and can't speak English. So would the officer be able to choose both Black and possibly Hispanic?
No, not on this. For this, they really have to choose one primary one just to make the data as useful as possible. Again, that is something that we could modify, but when you start splitting it that way, it gets kind of difficult to answer some of the broader questions, which is what this is primarily for.
Thank you.
Councilmember Boyce.
Thank you, Madam President. Good data. And typical, we collect data for a reason. I remember we asked to get this data, and I'm just asking out loud, what is the end goal? We collect this data. It's nice to have. Is it just nice to have, or are we going to do something with this data, or what?
Yeah, so I think there's kind of two aspects to it. One was because those questions were coming up about demographics. I think primarily it's a public trust thing. The reason that we're doing this is because we want to track what our officers are doing so that we can then, answer those questions. And, and obviously if there was some issue that came up, address the issue. So the public trust, I think, is what really spurred it in the first place. But I think a secondary part is kind of what we talked about with the mapping, is that decision about allocation of resources. If we don't know what we're doing, if we're not tracking what our officers are out doing, it's really hard to make good decisions. And so this is a tool now where instead of kind of generically thinking that we're going to, hey, we should go make more contacts, we can be a lot more precise and specific, and then we can track and then see if it did anything. Yeah.
Councilmember Boyce, if I could add a little bit to that. Eric's doing an awesome job. A couple things on that. Woefully behind, but state law a couple legislative sessions ago mandated that we would do use of force data and some of the contact data that's coming so they're way behind. The good news on that is we're ahead of the game. We made a commitment to do it before we were required to and before the system was in place by the state. So I think it's really good to point out we did this ahead before we got compelled. Number two, we are one of the pilot contributing agencies that's working with the state to develop the statewide system. So I think it's really good that, and thank God we have talented people like Eric who built this from the ground up. We are moving ahead of the state, and we are being a part of what the state is going to bring to us. So I think that's a good deal. The other thing, and you asked what we would use this for, I very much believe that the data is out there, and we need to be in position to answer questions before they're asked, and we should know. I want to know that we're doing outstanding, and I want to know if we've got a problem. And so that's why the data is super important. The GIS component to this, that I'll just be honest, is way beyond me, allows us to use the data in a very precise way and improve our operation. So I just wanted to add those points.
Yeah, you answered my question. Thank you so much.
Councilmember Troutner.
Thank you, Council President. So following up on that, first of all, you're good. This is really a great program. Have we had any neighboring agencies ask about this or notice what we're doing or ask to have their own
Not that
part
I've
of
heard.
that? Or is this just something we're
Talk to
doing here in
Chief,
Kent?
But yeah, and I'm not sure if they're super aware of it yet. And I know this type of thing is common in different jurisdictions around the country, where they do a lot more tracking on every single contact than we do in Washington State, and potentially that's going to be required by legislature at some point, or like the chief said, kind of getting ahead of it in case that happens. But I haven't personally had anyone ask me about it.
Again, we're leading the way, so thank you.
No, this is awesome. Thank you so much. This definitely helps us look at the data and be like, okay, I think people have wrong perception in some places. And I'll tell you, looking at the percentage of stops and where it's warnings and tickets, and the one was the failure to yield, I thought that number was pretty high. So 4%, it's still pretty high, but in my mind, it was a lot higher than that. So looking at data, it's kind of like not everyone's reporting, I understand that, but from the data we've collected, 4%, I guess it's kind of puts everything in perspective. So thank you so much for doing the hard work and presenting this to us. And I'm excited to see what we have down the road. And I think we should definitely highlight this app to everyone and let them know that our neighboring agencies and the county, like, we're doing this amazing work, and I think you guys should be on board too, and learn from us, I guess, because we are leading the way, and this definitely helps answer a lot of questions. And like Chief said, if anything comes down the road, we are questioned about something, we have data to prove it. So I appreciate you, and I appreciate all the officers putting in the information for us to look at. And thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you. Any other questions or comments? Oh, Councilmember Fincher.
It might be nice to also start with our own people in town here so that our residents know, because it's been some of our residents who have had those questions, and from neighboring cities where you may think one thing is going on, but then we have the numbers to show this is what is going on, especially as we get more officers and get everyone actually contributing. You may think you're doing good here, bad there, but to have the numbers and show is a whole different story.
Anybody else? I think that is it. Thank you so much, Officer Doherty. And we are adjourned until 7 o'clock for council meeting. Thank you so much.